at Sheffield Hallam, and in my short time at IOE, I must pay tribute to his leadership. He's been a wonderful director for me and for everyone, I think. Can I also acknowledge Phil Rickard and John Polisort from University of Melbourne, colleagues from a long way back now, and particularly I want to express my pleasure to see Phil here. Phil was such a wonderful Dean of Education when I was at Melbourne, and continues to go from success to success. The last grant round was the best I think Melbourne's had in the time I've had a connection to the university, in education anyway. Also want to acknowledge Glenn Jones and JC Shin, close colleagues, colleagues who I work with actively on a number of projects, and none of those projects are dependent on funding. And I think, that's the kind of international collaboration which really matters, when you want to work together and you continue to talk to each other regardless of whether there's an economic driver or not. And in fact, you can be, in the nature of universities is you can be remarkably productive in a scholarly sense by often by assembling empirical research, which has been produced in other domains, without funding, through contemporary communication. What I'd like to do today is share a few thoughts with you about participation and stratification of participation, what you might call participation and equity. Equity with its double meaning of inclusion, where we're doing pretty well, and providing everyone with a fair start in life where we're not doing quite as well in higher education. It's a complex problem, education and society, as all of us who work as sociologists know. So I've developed a theoretical map which I hope can guide our thinking today.
Very clear.
Well, I hope you can read the slide. Actually, it could take a long time to explain this diagram. I think on second thoughts we might go to something more simple. Now this is what I plan to cover. And I want to use this as a seminar rather than a lecture. I think the format and your expertise suggest a seminar is appropriate rather than a lecture. So I'm going to lay out some data in different areas, put forward some propositions about interpretation, invite your sharing of that, invite your thoughts. So feel free to come in at any point. I'm not going to have a specific question and answer discussion format, but feel free to interrupt and to raise issues. But we do have quite a long time scheduled for this, so we can do a fair bit of talking after I finish as well. So first I want to talk about three macro trends in higher education. And when I talk about higher education, I'm actually using the American definition, tertiary education in the OECD sense, inclusive of 2-year diploma level courses as well as 3- or 4-year degrees and above. So it's that larger set of data, and I'm compelled to do that, firstly because I think that the American approach in this respect is right. I think we should include, we shouldn't make a distinction of high status between 2- and 3-year programs. And secondly, the UNESCO participation data are tertiary participation data, and you can extract from the UNESCO data degree level participation as well, but many countries don't provide that do provide tertiary, so we work with tertiary. And I think tertiary is more meaningful anyway. Award courses post-school. Okay, so the first trend I want to talk about is growth of participation towards what I think is a universal trend or near universal trend or across the world to high participation systems of higher education. Systems with more than 50% of the age cohort entering higher education. Not necessarily graduating, but entering. Now, the growth curve is, in the last 15 years, quite remarkable. And I don't think we've done enough thinking about what this means worldwide. We know what it means in our own countries. But nearly every country growth is occurring. In most countries, rapid growth is occurring, except for countries which earn less than about 7,000 USD per person on a national income basis. Now, it's interesting to look at the history. The dotted line gives you world population growth. GDP has grown at almost twice the rate. Real GDP has grown at almost twice the rate as population. Tertiary enrolment moved more or less lockstep with GDP until about 1991. And then it began to peel away and it began to climb. And you can see from the slope there that apart from the last little blip at the top, which partly reflects the drop in participation in the US data, that the most rapid growth has been in the last 10 years. This is the gross tertiary enrolment ratio, which is the numerator is the total enrolment, the denominator is the age cohort. So it tends to exaggerate age cohort participation because the numerator includes mature age participation. And in some countries that's more of an exaggeration than others. You also have effects related to international student movements in and out of the countries as well. So countries with a lot of international students like the UK or Australia tend to have exaggerated, quite grossly exaggerated participation figures, and Australia and the UK don't look nearly as good once you take the international students out. But in most countries the international effect is not great. Mature age effect varies, but the good thing about using GTDR data is it does give you trends and it gives you rough comparisons across countries as well. What's interesting about it is the way in which the participation growth accelerates. As I just pointed out, you've got 10% participation in 1970, you've got 14% in 1990, so very little change in those 20 years, or 40% increase but from a low base. And then it starts to climb, and it's soon climbing at 1% a year. 1% a year doesn't sound much, but 1% a year is 20% growth in 20 years. And in some countries, of course, it's been much more dramatic than that. That's an average figure. In North America and Western Europe as a block, almost four people in every 5 in the age cohort now attend some form of tertiary education. 4 in 5. The notion that people aren't educable seems to have gone. There's an assumption that nearly everyone is educable, I think, in that. In sub-Saharan Africa, which is the other end of the comparison on participation rates, participation is still very low, below 10% in the region, but it has increased at much the same rate as the world rate. That is, it's doubled in the last 15 years. Here's the regional picture, and you can see that in every region except Central Asia, the gross tertiary enrolment ratio is accelerating. The Arab states perhaps not as rapid as the other areas also, but East Asia and the Pacific, if you take out China, it's over 50%. Latin America and the Caribbean, in a number of countries, it's over 70%. And it's really the smaller island nations and the poorest continental nations like Bolivia and Paraguay which are holding the overall big picture down. But in Chile, Venezuela, Brazil, participation is growing rapidly. Central and Eastern Europe has always been not far behind North America and Western Europe. But the pattern of overall growth is stunning. And there's more. Oh, that's a pity.
That was your best slide, too.
Well, it was an interesting one. See if I can restore things. It's completely dropped out. Yeah, good. Back again.
It was a seat. It'll do that if you don't touch it. So if it cuts off, just
thank you for your excellent technical advice. I will try and avoid doing it again. Now, what's interesting about gross participation at the global level is the really big population countries are seeing a major shift. I mean, 3 of the 4 largest nations, Indonesia, China, India. In all 3 nations, we're now seeing, well, in Indonesia more than 1/3, in China about 1/3, in fact on the latest figures a bit higher I think, and in India coming up to 30% gross tertiary enrolment ratios. And what's driving the growth is the movement of people from the countryside to the cities. Similar things are happening in sub-Saharan Africa and the large and populated nations there as well. They're further behind the participation curve, but the same dynamic of people going to the cities, getting jobs, becoming quasi-middle class or a little, less than that. But cities are where tertiary education is provided. Schools are provided often in rural areas, but tertiary education tends to concentrate in larger cities. And also middle class demand can be effective politically. It can concentrate there as well. So you have all the dynamic of growth, middle class growth, concentrated in the cities. And you will see a massive increase in those three countries on all the indicators that we currently have. Short of a world war or some other cataclysm, this is going to go on. And so when it's in Indonesia, China, India, double their participation rate, then the demography of educated labour right around the world changes, and those nations start to provide a high proportion of professionals in many countries. So a very significant development. So in summary, you've got more than 100 systems at the mass education level that Martin Troe talked about, 15% participation. You've got more than 50 systems now at 50% participation, which he's called universal. And what he meant by universal was families need to participate. They can no longer afford to stay out of the system because of the penalties extracted on their children if they do. That you need tertiary education for normal, full-time, sub-professional, professional work, and you need it for social status in societies where the majority of people, or a near majority, are going to acquire it. It's really striking that in countries well below the average GDP per capita, that this same rapid growth is occurring. Now, I'm going to put more qualifications into participation as we go, but let me just say now, the thought that will have occurred to you that a lot of what we call participation that's measured in the statistics is not very strong educationally. Some of it's just online, some of it's online without teaching. A lot of it's in diploma mills, especially in the emerging countries, but also in the United States. So that, keep that in mind. But before we concentrate on the dark side, let's just reflect on the good side. We have done a remarkable thing in education, schooling and higher education. We are creating a worldwide high participation society. In that circumstance, not only do people have greater agency in the labour market and in life, and not only do women have the capacity to control their own fertility, for example, because they're educated, not only those things, also it means that you have a high level of political participation, a high level of political awareness, and you have the potential, I think, for much more international commonality, because tertiary education is a homogenising force. It brings people into a framework which is similar worldwide in many respects. The structure of qualifications, the nature of instruction and learning, the processes of certification and so on are similar worldwide. I mean, like engineering, for example. Just as a caveat to, as general participation expands, so does cross-border activity, and cross-border mobility is doubling every 10 years. It means that there will be many, many more international students in future than there are now. Although for the exporting countries, that raises the question of where they will go and how good the students will be that go to them.
Simon, can I just clarify
yes.
one point? I'm pretty sure you've mentioned, but when we talk about participation, it's any time in a person's lifetime?
We're talking about
yes, in terms of getting into higher years.
Yeah, the GTR will capture any enrolment.
So, and I think you did mention it before, but I just didn't quite grab it. So how much, given where we were and where we are now, how much of that growth is, I'll call it older age groups,
yeah.
those in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s, catching up on what they might have done had they been born 20 years ago rather than 60 years ago?
To answer the question well would take some time, and I can't do it on the spot, but I could just essay some general thoughts about how much that factor is playing out. In most countries, tertiary education is still understood as a young person's thing. In the Scandinavian countries, English-speaking countries, increasingly Korea and Taiwan, mature age entry is playing a larger role.
Okay, that's enough.
So, I mean, Korea's got fantastic participation. It's the world leader. And I think my guess would be, JC, you can correct me, that the real age cohort participation is probably 90%. But the GTR figures take it over 100 because of the mature age factor. So you have this funny thing. Greece has got 115% participation because I think everyone's in the workforce needs to be enrolled nominally. I mean, there must be some social service benefit associated with that. But you know, yes, that factor is a really relevant one, and I'm using quite crude data with the GTR, but I want to look at the big picture, and it gives me a good summary. So, but you're quite right to ask the question. My sense is that mature age participation is more important than it was 20 years ago overall, but I doubt if that figures a large effect at a world level.
Okay.
Now, why? Why this phenomenal expansion? Is it just our good marketing campaigns that's generating this? Is it the benign influence of government that seeks to help its population? You know, what is it? Is it demand in the economy that's driving the need for ever higher skills, ever higher levels of work? I suspect not. Let's run through the possible explanations, and this, of course, is a very open question. Well, first, I've done a number of inquiries into the relationship between economic growth and participation trends. This slide has the 33 countries that have seen the largest growth in the GTR. I mean, led by Albania, where the GTR over this 10-year period jumped 40%. Going all the way down to that low-growth country, China, you know, where it jumped almost 20% in 10 years. So there's a lot in between. Some of them are substantial economies and societies, some of them are small ones. But you know, Argentina, Iran, Turkey, Chile, these are not negligible nation states. So massive growth in many places is one part of this story, but the other thing is see where the GDP and average annual growth figures are. They're all over the place. I subsequently took the 20 largest population countries and then correlated that systematically against, you know, it's correlated enrolment trend growth against GDP growth. And there is a line of best fit which shows a slight slope. So there is a weak correlation between economic growth rates and participation growth, but it's only weak. It's not as strong as another correlation I'm going to show you in a minute. Schofer and Mayer are the first, really the only substantial article in the literature on this worldwide pattern of growth. 2005 American Sociological Review did a historical analysis where they found that in the 60s there was a weak correlation between economic growth and growth of participation, but after the 60s, once you get through the initial development of mass education, that correlation largely disappears. So the relationship between economic growth in their study and participation growth was weak to negligible. In countries with widely varying industry configurations, you know, high skill manufacturing like Taiwan, Korea, or you know, Germany or Finland, countries with high service economies like the United States, from you know, countries where unemployment is high, all countries really except those which continue to retain very large agricultural sectors, you see high growth. So from in a huge range of different industry configurations, different skill sets, different labour market requirements, you see high growth. So something else is happening apart from pull from the economy. The human capital equation is beginning to look shaky. I will try and shake it further. Is the state the driver? Well, yes and no. The state seems to play the central role in the movement from elite to mass education. The state makes the decision at that point in almost every case to create infrastructure, to train tertiary teachers, to encourage, in some cases, research at that early stage and so on. Establish a framework of institutions which can accept demand. The middle class sees the opportunities, starts to express demand, maybe starts to enrol domestically rather than sending its children abroad in some cases. And then once that dynamic of growth is established, it doesn't seem to reverse, and it seems to become self-sustaining. And this was Tro's argument about participation, that as it grows, as I said before, it becomes more and more necessary to families, to the point where when it reaches the universal stage in his calculation, the 50% stage, what I call the high participation systems stage, it becomes quasi-compulsory for all but the poorest families. So that dynamic of growth seems to, at a certain point in the growth cycle, become self-sustaining, and the state no longer has to provide finance or other incentives to encourage people to be in tertiary education. In the case of poorer families, it may have to do so. In the case of underrepresented groups, it may have to do so. In the case of women in engineering, it may have to do so, and so on. But, and particularly rural and isolated students, not just low-income families, but rural and isolated. The state may still have to work on participation at the margin, but the core of participation, the urban middle-class growth, once established, doesn't seem to be reversible. And that's what's interesting. No country has ever reversed the tendency to growth, high participation. You get situations where it plateaus for a while, and sometimes it drops a little, but it goes back up again. The dynamic is unstoppable. So the state continues to facilitate it, but the state also finds that despite the growth, it can find ways of reducing the cost to itself by transferring part of the cost to the user and the family. And while that's not a universal trend, and there's significant parts of Europe where tuition is free, for example, Mexico, there's been a long-running battle over that issue, and so on. Nonetheless, I think in about half of the countries you can see a tendency to increasing private cost. I said before that the correlation between economic growth and participation growth was weak, but the correlation between urbanisation, the percentage of the population that's urban, which is an increasing factor everywhere, and the percentage, the gross tertiary enrolment ratio, the correlation between those two percentage figures is very good. That's the line of best fit. I've arranged the 20 most populous countries in the world, although I didn't have data for 4 of them and had to substitute the next 4. The grey line is the percentage of the population in urban areas, and the bars are the GTER, and you can see the line of best fit's very clear. I mean, there's nations where, like South Korea, USA, where participation is higher than urbanisation. There's nations where, like Mexico, Indonesia, China, still, Pakistan, Congo, where participation is lower than urbanisation would suggest, but the overall pattern is very strong. And I think this goes back to the point I made before, that demand concentrates in cities, it concentrates led by the middle class, and then the lower middle class, and then everyone begins to come in. And the political pressure is put on to provide infrastructure for tertiary education in the cities. We haven't seen nothing yet, as Al Jolson said, we ain't seen nothing yet. The growth of the middle class projected in the famous Brookings OECD projection 2010 was for an increase in Asia alone, from $500 million in 2009 to 3.2 billion in 2030. That is almost 6 times, or about 6 times. The Brookings figure has been questioned. The World Bank has a more conservative figure, but the World Bank figure involves, over the same 21-year period, about an increase of more than a multiplication of more than twice the size of the global middle class. Now, that means a multiplication in those who are able to effectively put pressure on their governments to demand tertiary education places, a multiplication in those who can afford to share part of the cost of tertiary education, both through taxation and through private funds. So the dynamic of growth will continue, but much of that bulk comes from India and China. Okay, the second trend I want to point to is the spread of the movement for world-class universities and the spread of research out of its traditional zone of North America, Western Europe, Japan, Russia, Australia, to a much larger number of countries. Ironically, the spread of national research capacity is a function of globalisation. Globalisation has created a single world research system, so that the dominant research in the sciences and parts of the social sciences is the global conversation in the English language. And while it's true that the national research conversation is still more important in the humanities, in languages, in some of the professional social sciences perhaps, maybe not business studies, but the other areas, nonetheless, the science is a major driver of this process. And science, of course, is tremendously important for nations in the nation-building process, science and technology. The lodestone is always applied science, the capacity to create and facilitate innovation, But to have an innovative capacity, as Malaysia found out to its cost, you have to have basic research capacity as well. You have to have your own PhD training capacity. You have to be able to join the conversation, get access to the knowledge as it arises, be part of the process of knowledge formation. Otherwise, you're not in the circuit. You're not part of the system. So to be part of that system, you need a national system as well. So more and more nations are developing research, developing PhD training of their own in some disciplines or all disciplines and so on. And that also brings with it the incentive to develop world-class universities. And of course the Shanghai ranking has played an enormous role in providing a kind of ideological framework for all of this. By giving people a neat definition of a world-class university in the top 500 as measured by the Shanghai Jiaotong. And the Shanghai Jiaotong is driven by basic science. I mean, it's true that the performance in the Shanghai Jiaotong ranking is above all carried by the big applied science areas, medicine and engineering, but the characteristic of those fields is that they also need life science and physical sciences underpinning them. So you actually need a fully developed research system. I don't know whether Nian Qilu knew what he was doing when he created, these incentives, but he did want to orientate us all to thinking about basic science. He has made that clear, and he succeeded. Now everyone wants to be in the peak group. It's like having nuclear power or a very wealthy economy. Everyone wants this, but no one can get it really, except the United States and the United Kingdom and one or two others. The Swiss, the Canadians can penetrate the group, but it's that's the sort of lodestone. That's what everyone's been driven towards. Just by the way, it's a complicated table. Let me just point out a couple of things to you. Total number of papers in the top 10%. Harvard's 6,892. Next best, Stanford, 3,083. Harvard is a total giant. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And just by the sheer number of papers too. Look at, Toronto, which is a huge university, as Glenn well knows, has got less than 2/3 of papers at Harvard. Michigan's big too. But that's where everyone wants to go, but it's hard to get there. But some nations are moving sharply on both participation growth and research growth. China, of course, is the obvious example, but Iran is actually the nation which is seeing the most rapid growth in science. Mainly in the physical sciences, mainly in the strategic sciences. There's also rapid growth going on in parts of Southeast Asia and Turkey. Tunisia, new kid on the block as far as research systems go. But these, apart from Thailand, all of these nations see rapid growth at both the mass education level and in the output of research universities. Now let's see how that maps. 37 systems have a GTR of more than 50%. High participation systems, and they have at least one top 500 university. And that's that list of systems. All the Anglosphere, a good chunk of European systems, only a small number of which have large numbers of research universities, and the emerging East Asian region. China's not here because China's GTR is not yet at 50%. Chile is an up-and-comer in the Latin American context. We don't have data for Brazil in that table because the Brazil figures are here. There are 7 systems that have WCUs with their GTR is below 50%. Now that's not, they're obvious candidates for high stratification. China is the most important, but Brazil, where we don't have a participation figure but it's below 50, is the second most important. South Africa, a good example of a highly unequal country which has significant research universities on top. Then there's a bunch of systems that have 50% participation but no WCUs, but they're mostly small countries. I mean, we shouldn't spend too long talking about San Marino and Palau here. They're not likely to get world-class universities. Thailand has sometimes had Chulalongkorn in the top 500 group. Kazakhstan is working very hard, as some will know, to get there as well. Cuba has extraordinary research but no WCUs and not likely to get any. Ukraine has been interrupted. The Baltic states are very small. They've got very impressive social indicators but they are small. The third trend I want to point to is the ever-growing importance of East Asia, and I still have to dwell on this, but I think in this group, perhaps you know more about it than most of my colleagues in the UK. I'm still trying to educate on this point. We still look at Europe because that's where we get our big research grants, that's where the UK does so well. And we don't look at East Asia much because it's a long way away. When I was in Australia, we looked at East Asia all the time. I'm now talking about the Sinic cultural sphere, the sphere of Chinese civilization, and that includes Vietnam as well, as the